Her ex drugged her cocktail, and the Mafia boss noticed. What he did next left the entire bar silent. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Sarah had always been a bit of a romantic, despite the hardships life had thrown her way. She was 28, with deep brown eyes that reflected the struggles she'd gone through. A young woman who had worked tirelessly as a waitress at a local bar in New York City, Sarah spent her nights serving drinks to a crowd that seemed to have no worries. But tonight felt different. She had been through a rough breakup with her ex-boyfriend, Jake, just a few weeks ago. He had been possessive, controlling, and had caused her more pain than she cared to admit. Despite everything, she thought she was over it. But tonight, Jake was back. She didn't expect to see him here, at the same bar she worked at. She had been trying to forget him, to move on, but there he was, sitting at the bar with that same smug look on his face. He noticed her almost immediately, flashing a crooked grin that sent a chill down her spine. Sarah tried to ignore him, going about her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the night went on, Sarah felt herself growing more and more uneasy. Her ex had made his way to the bar, and she could feel his eyes on her. Every time she passed by him, she could see him watching her, his gaze lingering for just a moment too long. She tried to focus on her job, but it was hard to ignore the tension in the air. Then, just when she thought she could get through the night without any trouble, Jake called her over to his table. "Sarah, come here," he said, his voice dripping with a mixture of arrogance and something else she couldn't place. She hesitated for a moment, but with a deep breath, she walked over to him. "What do you want, Jake?" she asked, her voice steady but her nerves on edge. He just smirked. "A drink for old time's sake," he said, motioning for her to pour him another cocktail. Sarah did as she was told, trying to keep things civil. As she placed the drink in front of him, she noticed something strange. Jake was acting off. His movements seemed too smooth, too calculated. "You look good, Sarah," he said, his eyes scanning her face. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Something was wrong. She had no idea how, but she could sense it. She looked down at the drink, then back at Jake, a subtle hint of concern flickering in her eyes. But she didn't have time to react. She felt a sudden wave of dizziness. The world around her seemed to spin, and her vision blurred. She reached out to steady herself, but the next thing she knew, she was on her knees in front of Jake. The floor was spinning, and her breath was shallow. "What the hell did you do?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. Before Jake could answer, a deep voice interrupted him. "That's enough," the voice said, calm but filled with authority. Sarah's head turned, and her blurry vision slowly focused on a man standing near the entrance of the bar. He was tall, with sharp features and a gaze that could pierce through anyone. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and something in the way he looked at her made her heart race. He stepped forward, his presence demanding attention. Sarah felt a strange sense of security, even though she had no idea who this man was. "You," he said, turning his attention to Jake. "Leave her alone." Sarah barely had time to process what was happening. She heard Jake protest, but it was clear that this stranger was not someone to be trifled with. The Mafia boss had arrived. As Sarah tried to regain her composure, the dizziness swirling around her head began to fade. The floor beneath her felt unsteady, but the figure standing in front of her, Dante, was like a solid anchor, a force of nature she could not ignore. He moved with calm authority, his sharp, dark eyes never leaving her. She glanced up at him, still struggling to breathe properly, but as his gaze softened, she felt an unfamiliar sense of safety wash over her. Her ex, Jake, was still standing nearby, visibly agitated, but it was clear that Dante wasn't worried. "You should leave," Dante said again, his voice firm but controlled. Jake, to his credit, didn't fight back. He looked from Dante to Sarah and back to Dante, then muttered a curse before storming out of the bar, his pride clearly wounded. Sarah's head spun as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. What was this man doing here? Why had he stepped in so quickly, so decisively? She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. Dante seemed to sense her hesitation. "You're okay," he said, his tone softening slightly as he knelt down beside her. "You're not alone." Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. He didn't seem like anyone she knew. His tailored suit, his air of authority, the way the room seemed to part around him. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a place like this without attracting attention. Yet, despite everything, he hadn't even asked her for anything in return. He'd simply intervened. Sarah tried to gather her thoughts. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why?" She trailed off, unsure of how to finish the question. Dante stood up slowly, his presence somehow making the room feel smaller. He extended a hand to help her up, his grip warm and reassuring. "No need to thank me," he said, "but I don't like seeing people take advantage of others." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Sarah forgot about everything. The confusion, the fear, the doubts. She focused solely on him. There was something about his calm, assured demeanor that made her feel like everything would be okay, that she could breathe again. But she couldn't quite shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something much bigger than just a simple bar altercation. Dante didn't look like a man who spent his nights dealing with petty squabbles. His eyes, those cold, intense eyes, had already seen too much. And his words were weighed down by experience, the kind that only came from living in a world where every decision mattered. Sarah felt a rush of anxiety. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. Dante looked at her for a long moment before answering. His eyes softened, but only for a brief second. "Nothing," he said. "I don't need anything from you." Sarah wasn't convinced. She wanted to trust him, but the nagging thought of what might come next lingered. She had been in enough bad situations to know that things rarely ended without a price. "But I'm not from around here," she continued, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to get involved in something I don't understand." Dante smiled slightly, a gesture that seemed almost knowing. "You're already involved," he said, his tone carrying an edge of finality. "And you've been involved longer than you think." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, Dante straightened up, offering his arm to her. "Let me walk you to your car," he said. "I can't let you walk out of here alone." Sarah hesitated for a moment. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he cared, but the thought of walking into the night on her own, still shaken, was even less appealing. "Okay," she said, nodding slowly. As they walked toward the door, Sarah couldn't help but glance back at the bar. It was still buzzing with activity, but she no longer felt a part of it. She was leaving that world behind. Or so she thought. Dante led her outside into the cool night air. His car was parked nearby, sleek and black, an unmistakable symbol of wealth and power. "I don't usually do this," Sarah said, glancing at him as they approached the vehicle. "Help strangers?" Dante asked, raising an eyebrow. Sarah nodded. "Yeah, I mean, you don't even know me." He opened the door for her. "That doesn't matter." Sarah paused before getting into the car. "I'm not sure what you're offering, but I don't need anything from you." Dante's gaze held hers for a moment. "What I'm offering isn't something you can refuse," he said softly. "You're already in my world now." As Sarah sat in the back seat of Dante's sleek black car, the night air whizzing past her, she tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. The world outside felt like a blur, as if her life was suddenly moving in fast forward while she remained stuck in a fog of confusion. Dante's presence in the car was impossible to ignore. His aura, so strong, made her feel as though he could stop time with a single glance. The strange thing was, despite the fear she had felt earlier, now she wasn't afraid of him. She was terrified of what this all meant. Who was he? Why had he intervened so forcefully when she needed someone the most? Was he just being kind, or was there a deeper reason behind it? Dante's calm demeanor was both reassuring and unsettling. She caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror as he drove, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked straight ahead. He wasn't one for small talk, and neither was she. The silence hung in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they both understood that words weren't necessary. After a few minutes, he broke the silence. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady. "No one's going to hurt you." Sarah glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. "How can you be so sure?" she asked, her voice quiet. Dante didn't look at her, but responded with a confidence that sent a shiver down her spine. Because I won't let them. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her believe him. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like someone was on her side. Dante's car soon pulled up to a grand, gated estate. The gates opened as if they had been expecting him, the guards on either side nodding respectfully. Sarah's heart raced as the car drove up the long, winding driveway, the large mansion looming in front of her like something out of a movie. She had never seen anything like it in person. Everything about this place screamed wealth and power, but there was something intimidating about it too. As the car stopped, Dante turned to her. "This is where you'll be safe," he said. Sarah felt a mix of emotions flooding her. She had no idea what to expect here, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going back to her old life. Not after tonight. Not after meeting him. Dante opened the door for her and stepped out. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then followed him, her feet feeling heavy as they stepped onto the cold marble floors of the mansion. Everything inside was pristine, immaculate. The walls were lined with artwork, and the lights shone brightly, reflecting off the polished floors. It felt like walking through a palace, but it didn't feel like home. Dante led her through a large foyer into a private wing of the house. "This is where you'll stay for now," he said, his voice soft but firm. Sarah stood at the threshold of the room he had just opened for her. The room was large, with a massive bed in the center, draped in dark velvet linens. The windows were framed by heavy curtains, and the lighting was dim and soothing. But it was the security, 3 men in black suits standing in the corner, that made Sarah realize just how different her life was about to become. "I don't belong here," she muttered, more to herself than to Dante. Dante stepped closer to her, his gaze softening. "You do now. You're safer here than anywhere else." She looked at him, her heart still racing. She had never been in a situation like this. The fear of the unknown gripped her, but so did a strange sense of calm. It was as if Dante had a power over the world around him. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Dante looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Now, you stay here, and I take care of things. No one will hurt you again." His words held an undeniable finality. Sarah didn't know what that meant, but she wasn't sure if she should be relieved or afraid. Before she could ask more, Dante turned to leave. "Get some rest," he said, his tone gentle but commanding. "You'll need it." Sarah stood in the room, staring at the door as he walked out. Her mind was racing. She didn't understand this world, but she had just been pulled into it. Was Dante the kind of man who helped people, or was there something more to him? She didn't know, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to find out. All she knew was that she couldn't go back to the life she had before. Not after what had happened tonight. Sarah sat down on the bed, the weight of the situation finally hitting her. She felt like she was at the edge of something new, something dangerous. And no matter how much she wanted to run, she knew that she was already in too deep. The next few days passed in a blur for Sarah. The mansion felt like a strange dream she couldn't wake up from. Everything was luxurious and cold, yet somehow, it still didn't feel like home. She spent her time in the guest room Dante had given her, wandering the halls when she could. The mansion was massive, filled with silence that made her feel like she was walking through a museum, but every now and then, a glance outside the windows reminded her that she was far from the life she once knew. The weight of it all sat heavily on her chest. She hadn't gone back to work, not since the night Dante had stepped in. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the rush of panic as Jake's face twisted with malice. And then, there was Dante. He hadn't spoken much to her since the night he brought her here, only checking in on her occasionally to make sure she was comfortable. But there was something in his eyes, the way he looked at her sometimes, that unsettled her. It wasn't like anything she had ever felt before. He was so different from the men she had known. Power and control seemed to ooze from every pore. He moved like he owned everything around him, including her. It wasn't just that he was dangerous. There was something far more captivating about him. Dante wasn't the kind of man you just crossed paths with and forgot. She couldn't ignore the strange pull she felt whenever he was near, even if she didn't fully understand it. One afternoon, after what felt like days of wandering the house in a daze, Sarah was sitting in the massive living room when Dante finally came to find her. He looked as calm and collected as ever, his dark eyes unreadable as usual. "You look like you've been thinking too much," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Sarah hadn't realized how much time had passed, how long she had been lost in her own thoughts. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, almost as if she was expecting him to provide an answer. "You're safe here," Dante said, his gaze steady. "That's all that matters for now." Sarah frowned, trying to make sense of his words. She wasn't sure if he meant that in the way she wanted him to, or if he had something else in mind. She could sense the tension between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air. "But I can't stay here forever," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. She didn't belong in this world. Dante stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to worry about that. For now, you're safe, and that's enough." He paused, his expression darkening slightly. "The world you knew is gone. It's time for you to accept that." The weight of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been running from her past, from Jake, from everything. But now she was running into something she didn't fully understand. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dante didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned away and moved toward the window, gazing out over the vast grounds that stretched beyond the mansion. "It means you're not in control anymore," he said quietly. "The life you had before, it doesn't exist anymore. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can move forward." Sarah's heart raced. She had never felt more out of place, more uncertain of everything around her. She wanted to leave, to run, but a part of her knew that she couldn't. She had nowhere to go. Dante's gaze turned back to her, and for a moment, she saw something else in his eyes, a flicker of something softer. "You're not alone, Sarah," he said, his voice almost gentle. "You're not going back to that life. Not if I can help it." Sarah stood up slowly, her legs shaky. "What are you going to do?" she asked, unsure of what to expect. Dante's eyes hardened, his expression returning to its usual intensity. "I'm going to make sure you're protected. No one touches you again." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified. She had never been in a situation like this before. Everything about Dante's world was dangerous, unpredictable, but in some twisted way, she felt like she was finally in control of her own fate. Or maybe, it was Dante who controlled everything. The thought unsettled her even more. "But how do you know I want your protection?" she asked, taking a step back, unsure of how to feel. Dante looked at her with that same intense gaze, as if he could read every thought in her mind. "You may not want it, but you need it," he replied. "Trust me." His words were like a command, and Sarah felt a strange urge to obey. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping further into a world she didn't understand, a world where she was no longer just a victim, but something else entirely. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself once again alone in the mansion, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite process. She didn't know what Dante's next move was, but she couldn't help but wonder, was this really for her protection, or was it something more, something darker? The next few days were a blur for Sarah. Dante's mansion had become her temporary sanctuary, but the unfamiliar luxury weighed on her. Despite the massive, elegant space, she felt like a stranger in her own life. Everything was pristine, from the marble floors to the towering windows, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. She was grateful for Dante's protection, but something in her gut told her that the more she stayed here, the harder it would be to leave. Her thoughts circled back to Jake, her ex, and the poison he had slipped into her drink. She knew she had to confront him at some point. He wouldn't stop until he had her back, and she wasn't sure she could keep running forever. Dante hadn't mentioned Jake since that night, but Sarah had seen the way his eyes darkened whenever she brought up her past. He wasn't the kind of man to forget things. She wondered how much Dante knew about her life before he had come into it. His protective nature was unsettling, though she couldn't deny that it made her feel safer than she ever had. But there was more to him than that. She could sense it in the way he moved, the quiet authority he carried, and the way his men seemed to follow his every command without question. It was obvious that Dante wasn't just a businessman or a good Samaritan. He was someone who lived in a world far more dangerous than she could imagine. Sarah spent her days in the mansion, pacing through the rooms, trying to avoid the heavy silence that surrounded her. She had spent years surviving on her own, working long shifts at the bar, dealing with men like Jake. She hadn't ever relied on anyone, and now here she was, depending on a man she barely knew, in a world that felt far too dangerous to navigate. But Dante had told her she was safe. Was it possible she could trust him? She didn't know, but she had nowhere else to go. It was late one evening when she found herself in the main hall, staring out the window at the dark night sky. She had been sitting in silence for hours, trying to push back the flood of emotions that had been overwhelming her. It was then that Dante appeared, his presence as commanding as ever. He stepped into the room without a sound, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You're thinking too much," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sarah turned toward him, trying to steady her breath. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't even know who you are or why you're doing this for me." Dante's expression softened for just a moment, his gaze unreadable. He crossed the room and stood beside her, looking out the window at the city below. "You don't have to know everything right now," he said quietly. "What matters is that you're safe, and you will stay safe." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But what happens when I'm not safe anymore?" she asked, her voice laced with fear. Dante's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You won't have to worry about that," he said, his tone steady. "No one will ever hurt you again." Sarah felt her heart race at his words, a chill running down her spine. There was something about the way he said it, something that made her wonder just how far Dante would go to protect her. And then, without warning, his hand reached out and gently brushed against her cheek. The touch was unexpected, tender in a way that sent a jolt of heat through her. Sarah stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. She had never been this close to a man like him, someone so powerful, so composed, yet so dangerously captivating. Dante didn't move, his eyes fixed on her. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said, his voice low. "I'm not your enemy, Sarah." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She wanted to ask him why he was doing this, why he was helping her, but the question seemed to die in her throat. Dante took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I need you to trust me. For now, that's all I'm asking." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the situation. Everything about Dante screamed danger, yet there was something about him that made her feel like she could trust him. It was a dangerous game she was playing, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure if she was ready to walk away from it. "Trust you," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Dante nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, trust me, Sarah, and I will make sure nothing happens to you." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at him, trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. She didn't know if she could, but for some reason, she wanted to believe him. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll trust you." Dante's smile was small, but it was enough to send a spark of hope through her. He stepped back, his expression returning to its usual calm. "Good," he said. "That's all I need." As Sarah watched him leave the room, she felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. What had she just agreed to? And what kind of life was she about to walk into? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain. She was in deeper than she had ever been before. The days after Sarah's agreement to trust Dante passed in a haze. The mansion that had once seemed imposing and cold now felt almost familiar, yet every corner still carried the weight of its grandiosity. Sarah's mind wandered, but it wasn't just the house that consumed her thoughts. It was Dante, the way he moved, the power he held, the way he made her feel both safe and terrified at the same time. She wasn't used to this feeling of dependence. She had always been on her own, surviving one day at a time, never needing anyone, never letting anyone in. But Dante was different. Every time he spoke, his words carried a weight that made her feel like her world was shifting, even when she wasn't sure if she wanted it to. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, Sarah would hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the hum of the mansion's quiet machinery. She would lie there, staring up at the ceiling, wondering if Dante was watching her from some hidden corner, as though he could always see her, even when she couldn't see him. She didn't know how long she could live in this strange limbo, trapped between the life she had known and the one Dante was pulling her into. He hadn't pushed her to do anything yet, but Sarah could feel the pull of his world, the world of power, danger, and control. She couldn't deny it anymore. She was in deeper than she realized. One afternoon, Dante came to her with a different kind of request. His tone was serious, more so than she had ever heard before. "I need you to come with me," he said, his voice steady. There's something I have to take care of, and I can't do it alone. Sarah raised an eyebrow, curiosity piquing her despite the nervous flutter in her chest. What's going on? She asked, already knowing that whatever it wasn't going to be something simple. Dante didn't explain much, but his gaze told her everything she needed to know. It wasn't a request, but a command. She had already agreed to trust him, and now she would have to prove it. It's not safe for you here anymore, he continued, his voice low, almost with an edge of urgency. I need you to see something, understand something. The intensity in his eyes made it clear that whatever was about to unfold would change everything. Sarah didn't argue. She simply nodded, knowing that for better or worse, her life was no longer in her control. The drive was long, and as they left the safety of the mansion, Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The world outside was different. It was darker. Dante's car cut through the streets of the city, moving quickly, as if he was on a mission. Sarah couldn't help but notice the men in suits who followed them in other vehicles, their presence subtle but undeniable. Where are we going? She finally asked, her voice a whisper. Dante didn't look at her, his focus solely on the road ahead. I'll show you, he said. The drive seemed endless, but eventually, they arrived at a part of the city Sarah had never seen before. The streets were darker here, the buildings taller, more imposing. There was an air of danger that hung over the area like a heavy fog. They pulled up in front of an old warehouse, the kind of place Sarah only ever saw in movies or news stories. Dante parked the car and stepped out without a word, his bodyguards quickly following his lead. Sarah hesitated, then followed him, her heart racing with uncertainty. Stay close, Dante said, his voice serious as he led her inside. The warehouse was dark, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The only light came from a few scattered bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dimness, and she saw the figures in the shadows, men standing still, waiting. She could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of something bad about to happen. Dante led her further inside, his movements calm, controlled. She could hear the faint sound of voices coming from behind a door at the far end of the warehouse. What's going on, Dante? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He glanced back at her, his eyes dark with intent. I'm taking care of something that should have been handled a long time ago, he said, his tone cool. And I need you to see it for yourself. The door creaked open, and Sarah followed Dante into the room. Inside, a man was sitting at a table, his hands bound to the chair. His face was bruised, and he looked as though he had been through hell. He barely lifted his head when they entered, his eyes clouded with fear. This is what happens when you cross me, Dante said, his voice low, the authority in his words undeniable. The man flinched at the sound of his voice, but didn't speak. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. This was no ordinary meeting. This was business. Dangerous business. She had seen this side of Dante before. The man who took control, who never let anyone get in his way. The man who protected her, but did so in ways she didn't fully understand. As Dante stepped closer to the man, his eyes never left Sarah. You're safe here, he said again, though this time, the meaning behind his words was different. Sarah wasn't sure whether to believe him, but she knew one thing. She was already in too deep. The next few days felt like a slow-motion blur for Sarah. She couldn't shake the image of the man in the warehouse, the man Dante had shown her, bound to a chair. Dante had done what he said he would do. He took care of business. But something about it felt wrong. Sarah didn't know how to reconcile the man who had saved her with the man she saw in that room. It was as though two different people existed inside him. At night, she would lie awake in her guest room, listening to the distant sounds of the mansion, trying to make sense of the life she was now a part of. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but Dante had made it clear, her old life was gone. There was no going back to the bar, no returning to her old routine. She had agreed to trust him, but every time she looked at him, she saw something darker, something she didn't fully understand. Dante never spoke of the night in the warehouse again, but Sarah could feel the shift in the air. There were subtle changes. More guards, more surveillance, and a sense that Dante's world had expanded beyond the mansion's walls. The night air had started to feel colder, and Sarah began to realize just how deeply Dante's influence ran. But despite the growing sense of unease, there was one thing she knew for sure. Dante was right. She was safe. Safe from Jake, safe from the dangers she had been running from. Safe in a way that made her feel like she didn't need to look over her shoulder anymore. The next time she saw Dante, it was in the study. She had wandered the halls that day, feeling like a prisoner of sorts, unsure of what she was supposed to do or where she fit in this strange world. Dante had invited her in. She had tried to avoid him, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. He was standing by the fireplace, the low fire casting a glow on his sharp features. When he turned to look at her, there was something unreadable in his expression. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone casual, but with an edge that suggested he was waiting for something more. Sarah hesitated for a moment. "I've been thinking," she finally said. "About everything." Dante raised an eyebrow, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Everything." Sarah bit her lip. "About you. About why you're doing this." Dante's eyes softened for a moment, but the hardness was still there, lurking beneath the surface. "You want answers, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low, almost amused. "There's a reason I brought you here, but you're not ready to hear it yet." Sarah frowned, frustrated by his cryptic words. "I'm not sure what you want from me," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. Dante walked over to the desk, picking up a glass of whiskey. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I'm doing this because I can. Because I have the means to protect you. Because no one else will." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't need protection," she said, more defensively than she intended. Dante looked at her, his gaze sharp. "You do," he said, his voice firm. "You just don't realize it yet." Sarah's chest tightened. She couldn't argue with him. Deep down, she knew he was right. The world she had known was dangerous, and Dante had pulled her out of it. But what was he expecting from her? What was he preparing her for? Dante took a step closer, his presence looming over her. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his tone softer now, as if he was trying to reassure her. But Sarah didn't feel reassured. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand, and the longer she stayed here, the more she realized how little control she had over her own life. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dante reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It wasn't a comforting touch, it was possessive, as though he was marking her as his own. "You're going to learn to trust me," he said quietly. "And when you do, everything will make sense." Sarah pulled her hand back, her mind spinning. She wanted to trust him, but everything about this life felt wrong. She didn't belong here. Dante studied her for a moment, his eyes unreadable. "You can leave any time you want," he said, his voice cool, but there was an edge to it that made Sarah freeze. "But if you leave, you'll be back in the world you ran from. You'll be back in danger." The word struck her like a blow. She had run from Jake, from the life that had suffocated her, and now she was trapped in this gilded cage of Dante's world. She had no idea where it was all headed, but she knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The choice was no longer hers. She was already too far in. "I'll stay," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Dante nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good," he said, his tone almost satisfied. Sarah didn't know what the future held, but she knew that her life had changed forever the moment Dante stepped into it. And as she looked into his eyes, she couldn't help but wonder, was this really protection? Or was it something far more dangerous? The days that followed Sarah's decision to stay in Dante's world felt like a strange, surreal dream. The mansion, with its cold elegance and guarded silence, was both a haven and a prison. Sarah had accepted that there was no going back, but each day felt heavier. Dante's presence was all-consuming. He wasn't the kind of man you could ignore or forget. His power, his control, even his silence commanded attention, and she could feel it in everything around her. He was watching her, not in a way that was overt or obvious, but there was always an underlying awareness of her every move. Sarah tried to distract herself by exploring the mansion, but it was impossible to avoid the growing tension between them. The house was massive, with corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, grand rooms decorated with expensive art and luxurious furniture, and halls that felt like they went on forever. Yet, despite the sprawling space, it never felt like there was enough room for Sarah to breathe. Every time she looked out of the tall windows, she could see Dante's men moving outside, watching over the estate. Security was tight, not just around the mansion, but around her life. Dante had kept his promise. He had made sure no one from her past could reach her. The danger she had fled from had been cut off, but at the same time, she felt like a bird in a gilded cage. She was safe, but it came with a price. The luxury was suffocating. It wasn't the life Sarah had ever imagined for herself, but it was the life she was now forced to accept. Dante never pushed her, never asked anything of her except her presence. But the more time passed, the more Sarah began to wonder if there was more to the man than what he had shown her. Was he truly protecting her, or was there an ulterior motive? One evening, after dinner, Dante asked her to meet him in his office. Sarah had grown used to the quiet commands and the way he seemed to have everything under control, but tonight there was something different in his tone. It was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "I need to talk to you," he said, his eyes locking with hers as he stood by the door. Sarah nodded and followed him through the corridors, her heart racing slightly as she wondered what this conversation would be about. The office was a large, dark room at the far end of the mansion. It was impressive, the walls lined with bookshelves, a massive desk sitting in the center with leather chairs placed around it. Dante stood by the window, his back turned to her as she entered. He didn't move, but the weight of his presence was palpable. "Sit down," he said without turning. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then took a seat across from him. The air in the room felt thick, charged with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Dante finally turned, his gaze sharp as he looked at her. "I've been watching you," he said. "Not in a way that makes you uncomfortable, but I need to know that you're really ready for what's coming." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What's coming?" she asked. Dante's expression didn't change. He stepped forward, his movements measured, controlled. "Things are about to get complicated. You're not just a bystander in this world. You're involved now, whether you want to be or not." Sarah's chest tightened. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're going to be a part of this. A bigger part than you realize. The things I do, the things I protect, none of it is as simple as you think." Sarah felt the walls closing in on her. She had tried to distance herself from this life, but now Dante was making it clear that there was no escaping. "I never wanted to be a part of this world," she whispered. Dante looked at her with a mixture of understanding and something else, something unreadable. "You're already here, and you're not leaving. Not unless you want the rest of your life to be chaos." Sarah swallowed hard. Dante wasn't threatening her. He was telling her the truth, and that scared her more than anything. "So what am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dante paused for a long moment, studying her. "Trust me," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "That's all I'm asking for now. Trust that I'm keeping you safe. Trust that I'll take care of you." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Trust. She had trusted before, and it had only led her into a world of pain and betrayal. But with Dante, it felt different. There was power in his words, in the way he commanded the world around him. She didn't want to trust him. She didn't want to feel like she was losing herself in his world. But as she sat there, looking into his eyes, she realized that trusting him was her only choice. "I'll trust you," she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Dante's expression softened, but only for a moment. "Good," he said, his voice steady. "Now, things are going to get more complicated, but I'll make sure you're ready." Sarah wasn't sure what that meant, but one thing was clear. She was already in deeper than she had ever been, and there was no turning back now. Sarah had never felt the weight of a decision quite like this before. Trusting Dante, agreeing to stay in his world, it was a choice that both freed her and trapped her all at once. The days since that conversation in Dante's office had been a blur, but now, as the reality of her situation began to settle in, she knew she had to confront the consequences of her choice. The mansion felt quieter, almost eerie, as she walked through the halls, every step echoing in the vast, empty spaces. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. She had always been able to take care of herself, but now, in Dante's world, everything felt different. Dante, with his cold eyes and commanding presence, was not a man you could ignore. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she wasn't sure if she could ever truly leave. That night, Sarah found herself standing by the window in her guest room, gazing out at the sprawling grounds of the estate. The moonlight cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, the darkness outside seeming to stretch endlessly. She couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation, despite the luxury surrounding her. She had everything she could want: safety, protection, food, a roof over her head, but none of it felt real. None of it felt like home. As she stood there, lost in thought, the sound of footsteps approached. Dante. He had been more distant these past few days, and Sarah had begun to wonder if it was because he was preparing her for something she wasn't ready to face. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his figure outlined against the soft light of the hallway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. Sarah nodded, her heart racing in her chest. She had a feeling that whatever he was about to say would change everything again. "About what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dante stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. His eyes never left hers. "About your place here," he said, his tone more serious than she had ever heard it. "You're more involved than you think." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had a feeling she wasn't going to like where this conversation was headed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dante paused for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "This world, the one I've brought you into, it's not just about keeping you safe anymore," he said, his eyes darkening. "Slightly. I need you to be more than just a bystander." Sarah's confusion deepened. "I don't understand. I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to be left alone." Dante's gaze softened, but only slightly. He moved closer, standing just a few feet away from her. "You were never going to be left alone," he said quietly. "Not in this world." Sarah shook her head, trying to process what he was saying. "But I don't belong here," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I didn't ask for any of this." Dante's expression hardened, and for a moment, Sarah could see the weight of the world in his eyes. "No one ever does," he said, his voice low. "But sometimes, life doesn't give us choices. Sometimes, we have to make decisions that force us into a different path." Sarah's chest tightened as the realization hit her. She wasn't just a victim in this world. She was a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. "So, what are you asking me to do?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Dante looked at her for a long moment, and then he spoke, his voice steady but full of something Sarah couldn't quite name. "I'm asking you to choose. To choose whether you want to fight with me or against me." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. She had already chosen to trust him, but now she was being asked to take a much bigger step, to fight alongside him, to be a part of his world in ways she hadn't even begun to understand. "And if I choose not to?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dante's expression remained unreadable. "Then you leave. But leaving means you go back to the life you ran from, the danger you tried to escape." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had thought she wanted to leave, that she could just walk away and disappear, but now it seemed like there was no way out. "You're trapped," Dante said, as if reading her mind. "And so am I. But I'm offering you something more than just survival. I'm offering you a choice." Sarah felt the weight of his words settle in. What choice did she really have? She had already let him into her life. She had already trusted him. And now, she was being asked to commit to his world, to fight in a battle she wasn't sure she understood. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but finally, Sarah nodded. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steady. "But I don't know what that means." Dante's expression softened for a moment, but the hardness returned quickly. "It means you're mine now," he said, his voice cold but somehow comforting in its finality. "And you'll learn what that means soon enough." Sarah didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. She was in deeper than she had ever been, and there was no going back now. The weight of Dante's words lingered in Sarah's mind for days. She was his now. No going back. There was no escaping the world he had brought her into, and despite all the doubts, a small part of her felt a strange pull toward him. She didn't fully understand the depths of his world or the choices she had just made, but there was no turning back. Dante had made it clear that the price of her protection was her involvement. She didn't know what that meant yet, but as each day passed, she could feel the weight of the promise hanging over her. The mansion that once felt like a cage had started to feel more like a fortress. Guards patrolled the grounds, surveillance cameras kept watch, and every move she made was observed. It wasn't a life she had chosen, but it was the life she had now. Dante had given her everything she needed: safety, comfort, security, but that wasn't enough for him. He wanted something else. He wanted her loyalty. He wanted her to be a part of the life he lived, a life of power, danger, and unspoken rules. Sarah couldn't help but feel torn. On one hand, Dante had kept her safe, had given her something she hadn't known she needed, a sense of belonging, a sense of protection. But on the other hand, the longer she stayed in his world, the more she realized that her freedom was slipping away. One evening, Dante asked her to meet him in his office again. The urgency in his voice when he called for her made her heart skip a beat. She had grown used to his commands, to the way he moved through life like it was all part of a grand plan. But tonight felt different. Sarah walked through the mansion's long, silent hallways, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The large, dark office loomed at the end of the corridor, and when she entered, she found Dante standing by the window, looking out at the estate with that same quiet intensity he always carried. He didn't turn when she entered. "You're here," he said, his voice low. Sarah hesitated but nodded, taking a seat across from him. The air in the room felt thick, charged with something she couldn't quite understand. Dante turned from the window, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "There's something I need you to do," he said, his tone serious. Sarah's heart raced. "What is it?" she asked, trying to hide the nervousness in her voice. Dante walked over to the desk, his steps measured, and sat down, his hands clasped together. "You've been with me long enough now," he said. "You know the kind of work I do, the kind of people I deal with." Sarah nodded, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I need you to be involved," he continued, his voice steady. "Not just as a spectator, but as a participant. The people I deal with, there are those who need to be handled." Sarah's pulse quickened, and her chest tightened. "Handled?" she repeated. Dante's gaze never wavered. "Yes, there are things I need done, things you can help with." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I know you're not trained for this kind of work, but you've been learning, and you've shown me that you can handle yourself when it matters." Sarah swallowed hard. This wasn't what she had imagined when she agreed to stay. She had expected danger, but she hadn't expected to be pulled into it so directly. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. Dante leaned forward, his expression darkening. "There's someone who's been making a move against me," he said, his voice low. "A rival. I need you to help me deal with them." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Help you deal with them?" she repeated, the words tasting strange in her mouth. Dante nodded slowly. "I need someone I can trust to gather information, to make sure. I know everything about this person. You're the only one I trust right now." Sarah felt the weight of his words. He wasn't just asking for her loyalty. He was asking her to become a part of the dangerous world he inhabited, to step into the shadows with him. "What if I don't want to do this?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Dante's gaze softened for a brief moment, but his words were firm. "You don't have a choice, Sarah. This is the world we live in now. You're in it whether you want to be or not." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had known that this would come, that there would be a moment when she would have to decide if she was really ready to live in Dante's world. But now that it was here, now that she was being asked to cross a line, she wasn't sure if she could do it. "What happens if I say no?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dante stood up and walked to the window again, his back to her. "Then you leave," he said simply, his voice carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. "But remember this. If you leave, you'll be exposed to the world that's hunting you. You'll be on your own again." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had no choice. Not really. She was already in too deep. And with that, the truth hit her. She belonged to Dante now. There was no escaping this world. "I'll do it," she said, the words feeling heavier than she expected. Dante turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said, his voice low. "You've made the right choice." Sarah wasn't sure if it was the right choice, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. After Sarah's agreement to help Dante, the tension in the air grew thicker, almost unbearable. The following days felt like she was living in a world that wasn't entirely hers. Each task Dante gave her, no matter how small, drew her further into his dangerous life. She had told herself that she was just here for protection, that she wasn't involved in the darker side of things, but the truth was undeniable now. She was a part of it, whether she liked it or not. She had learned quickly that the life Dante led didn't leave room for hesitation or second guesses. He had given her a purpose, something to focus on. But as the days passed, Sarah realized that the more she became involved, the more she was losing herself in his world. There was no turning back now. Dante had made it clear. Sarah's new reality was a constant reminder of her decision. He had shown her the power he wielded, the people he controlled, and the lives he managed to destroy with the slightest flick of his wrist. She was working for him now, gathering the intel he needed to make his next move against his rival. But the more she learned, the more she understood that there was so much more to this world than she had ever imagined. The mansion, with its luxury and security, had started to feel like a gilded cage. She was no longer a part of her old world, but Dante's world wasn't a place she could just walk away from. She had already made too many compromises. It was one late evening when everything shifted again. Dante summoned her to his office, the same place where he had given her the choice to join him in his world. This time, however, the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Sarah walked down the hallway toward the office, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, but she had a feeling that tonight would be different. Dante was standing by the window when she entered, looking out at the estate. He didn't turn immediately, but instead seemed lost in his thoughts. Sarah hesitated by the door, unsure if she should speak or wait for him to acknowledge her. When he finally turned, there was something cold in his gaze, something sharp that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "I hope you're ready for what comes next," he said, his voice low and measured. Sarah swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to read him, to understand where this conversation was going. Dante stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "There are things I've been preparing for. Things that require your full involvement now." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had known it was coming, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure she could handle it. "I've been doing what you've asked," she said quietly. "I've been gathering the information you wanted, but I don't know if I can do more." Dante didn't seem to hear her doubt. He was already moving toward his desk, pulling out a folder. "The information you've gathered is good," he said, his tone calm, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "But it's not enough. You need to be more involved in the next steps." Sarah's mind raced. What was he asking her to do? He placed the folder in front of her, the papers inside a collection of names, locations, and cryptic messages. The complexity of it all hit her immediately. This wasn't just about gathering intel anymore. "I want you to do more than just find out where the rival is," Dante continued. "I need you to get close to him. Get the information I can't get by myself." Sarah's stomach turned. "Get close to him? How? I can't just walk up to him and ask for a handshake." Dante smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "You don't need to walk up to him. You just need to know where to stand, when to speak, and what to say." His words sent a chill through Sarah's body. She had never expected anything like this. She had thought she would be kept out of the more dangerous tasks, but now Dante was asking her to infiltrate the very heart of his enemy's operation. It wasn't just about protecting herself anymore. It was about being a part of his world, a world where nothing was off limits. "I don't know if I can do this," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Dante moved closer, his presence overwhelming. "You can," he said firmly. "You've already proven you can handle more than you think. And besides, you don't have a choice." Sarah looked at the papers in front of her, the weight of the task settling heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about power, about control. She had already stepped into this world, and now there was no turning back. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steadier now, though her heart was still racing. Dante leaned in, his eyes locking with hers. "You need to get close. Gain his trust, his confidence. And when the time comes, you'll deliver the information I need. I'll be watching." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind still reeling. This wasn't what she had expected. But this was Dante's world, and she was just another piece in his game. A game that had already taken over her life. She had made her choice, and now, she would have to live with the consequences. Sarah had never felt so trapped in her life. Each passing day since her agreement to help Dante had only further convinced her that she was irrevocably entangled in his world. It was no longer a matter of being an observer, watching from the sidelines. She was now a participant, thrust into a reality she could barely grasp. The task Dante had given her, getting close to his rival, was more than just a job. It felt like a test, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. And as she prepared for her first meeting with the enemy, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The mansion, once her sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. Dante's men were always around, watching her every move, and though she had grown accustomed to their presence, it still unsettled her. The guards, the surveillance cameras, it was all part of the life she had stepped into, and there was no escaping it. The more she learned about Dante's world, the more she understood how deep the web of power and influence stretched. She had become a piece in his grand game, and whether she liked it or not, there was no turning back. That night, Dante gave her the details of the assignment. She was to meet with one of his rival's associates at a private location, and her role was simple: gain their trust, get the information they had, and report back. Do not hesitate, Dante had told her, his voice cold but commanding. This is your chance to prove yourself. You're not just an asset anymore. You're part of my world. Sarah hadn't wanted to admit it, but the truth was clear. She was already more than just a bystander. She was part of the machinery now, whether she wanted to be or not. As she stood in front of the mirror, preparing for the meeting, Sarah barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The old Sarah, the one who had lived a simple life, had disappeared. She was now a different person, one who had learned to navigate a world of danger, lies, and manipulation. But even as she adjusted her dress and touched up her makeup, she couldn't shake the fear that clung to her. The fear of what might happen if she failed. The fear of what Dante might do to her if she didn't prove herself. When the time came, Dante's men drove her to the location. It was a discreet bar in the city, tucked away on a quiet street where no one would notice. Sarah had been briefed on the details. The man she was meeting, a mid-level associate of Dante's rival, was someone who could provide valuable intel about the rival's operations. She was to make him think she was just another woman looking for a connection, a game she knew how to play all too well. But this time, it wasn't about casual flirtation. It was about getting what Dante needed. As she entered the bar, Sarah's heart was pounding. The dimly lit room was filled with hushed conversations, and the smell of liquor hung in the air. She spotted the man right away, tall, dark-haired, with a presence that screamed power. He was sitting at a corner booth, nursing a drink. She took a deep breath and walked toward him, her mind focused, every step calculated. When she reached the booth, she slid into the seat across from him, offering a smile that was warm but carefully controlled. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice smooth and inviting. The man looked up, his eyes scanning her face before he nodded. "Sure, why not?" he said, his voice low, his accent thick. "What's your name?" Sarah hesitated for a split second before replying. "Sarah." She wasn't sure why, but something about the way he looked at her made her instinctively lie about her name. It wasn't the first time she had done it, but tonight, it felt different. The man studied her for a moment, clearly sizing her up, before offering her a drink. "You don't look like the usual crowd," he said. "What brings you here?" Sarah smiled, leaning in slightly. "I'm looking for something more," she said, her voice laced with just the right amount of intrigue. She could see his interest peaking, and she knew she had to keep him hooked. As the night wore on, she kept the conversation light, letting him talk about his business, about the rival group he worked for. Every word he spoke was another piece of the puzzle that Dante needed. She played her part, asking just the right questions, laughing at his jokes, and giving him just enough attention to keep him talking. But every time he mentioned Dante's rival, she could feel her nerves tighten. She was getting closer, but she also felt like she was walking a fine line. When the conversation started to drift to more personal matters, Sarah knew it was time. She subtly shifted the topic back to business, asking him about specific operations and connections. And sure enough, the man took the bait, revealing more than he probably intended. Just as Sarah was about to press further, she saw Dante's men standing at the entrance of the bar, watching her every move. That was her signal. She had what she needed. She stood up, giving the man one last smile. "It was nice meeting you," she said, her voice smooth. "I hope we can do this again sometime." He smiled, obviously pleased with himself, and handed her a card. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again," he said. As Sarah walked out of the bar, she could feel the weight of the moment settle on her. She had done it. She had completed her task, but as she stepped into the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. The world she was now a part of was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and there was no turning back now. As Sarah returned to the mansion, the weight of her actions hit her with full force. She had done it. She had crossed a line, gotten closer to Dante's enemy, and extracted the information he needed. But as she climbed into the back seat of the car, a heavy realization began to settle in. There was no going back now. She was no longer a mere bystander. She was part of the intricate web Dante had woven around her. She had become an active player in his world, and with that came the responsibility, the danger, and the consequences. Her heartbeat quickened as the car pulled into the mansion's driveway, the place she had once thought of, as her sanctuary now felt like a gilded cage. The guards were more present than ever, their eyes tracking her every movement. Sarah didn't even bother to look back as she entered the house. She knew, in the pit of her stomach, that there was no escape from this life now. The mansion, with its cold elegance and high walls, had become her prison. The door to Dante's office creaked open as Sarah entered. He was standing by the window again, just as he had been when she first met him. His back was to her, but Sarah could feel the shift in the air as she walked into the room. She had done exactly what he asked. She had gathered the intel, gained the trust of his rival's associate, and brought back the information he needed. She couldn't deny the pride she felt, but there was also a growing fear in her chest. "You did well," Dante said, his voice cutting through the silence. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw something softer in his eyes. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Sarah stepped further into the room, her heart still racing. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dante's expression darkened as he crossed the room to stand in front of her. "Now, we act," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Now, we eliminate the threat. Your part is done, but the real work begins." Sarah swallowed hard. She had known there was more to come, but hearing Dante speak so plainly about it made her heart race even faster. The gravity of what she was involved in had never been more apparent. "I did what you asked," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I helped you." Dante's eyes were unwavering. "You're part of this now, Sarah. You don't just help anymore. You're in this with me, whether you like it or not." His words sent a chill through her, but she didn't flinch. She had made her choice. She had already crossed the line. There was no way out, not without facing the consequences. "I'm ready," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Dante studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good. You'll be ready when the time comes." He turned back to the window, his expression becoming distant again. "You've proven yourself useful. But remember, you're not just working for me. You're part of something much bigger. This is my world, and now it's yours too." The weight of his words hit her all at once. She was in too deep to back out. She was no longer just a woman trying to escape her past. She was now a part of the power, the danger, and the ruthless world Dante had created. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had become a pawn in a game she couldn't control, but for the first time, she was starting to understand the rules. Dante was right. She was part of this now, and there was no going back. As she left the office, the cold air of the mansion wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. The guards, the surveillance cameras, the ever-watchful presence of Dante's world, it was all part of her new reality. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was active, involved, and she had no idea where this would all lead. But one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again. As she made her way back to her room, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Dante had made it clear. She was his, and she had no choice but to accept that. But somewhere deep inside her, a part of her wondered if this was the life she had been meant for all along. And as the days went by, she began to realize that the line between right and wrong in Dante's world was as blurry as the darkness outside the mansion's walls. She had crossed that line, and now there was no turning back. In this dark romance, Sarah finds herself drawn into a world of power, danger, and secrets. After a traumatic event, she is taken in by Dante, a mafia boss who promises her protection. As Sarah becomes more deeply involved in his dangerous life, she struggles to navigate the blurred lines between trust and manipulation. With each task she completes for Dante, Sarah's feelings become more complicated, and she begins to question whether she is truly safe or if she has unknowingly become a part of his dark world. The story explores the complexities of dark romance, where love, loyalty, and power intertwine, and the stakes are higher than Sarah could ever have imagined. As she walks deeper into Dante's world, she realizes that there's no escaping the hold he has over her. This dark romance shows the darker side of love and trust, with twists and turns that will keep readers hooked until the very end.